Number 1. Gary Tyler. On October 7, 1974, in Destrayan, Louisiana, school desegregation turned deadly. Black students from a court-ordered busing program rode the bus home from Destrayan High School through a hostile white neighborhood. A white mob surrounded the bus, throwing rocks, bottles, and screaming racial slurs. Gunshots rang out. 13-year-old white student Timothy Weber was hit and died. Chaos followed. No one saw who fired the fatal shot. No gun was found during the immediate search of the bus or the students on board. Yet within hours, 16-year-old Gary Tyler became the target. Gary Tyler was one of the black students on that bus. He had no weapon, he had no motive, he was not known for violence. Police pulled him off the bus, arrested him for disturbing the peace, and beat him while in custody. They charged him with first-degree murder. Prosecutors tried him as an adult in front of an all-white jury in a parish that was 25% black. The defense lawyer, who specialized in civil cases, spent barely an hour with Gary before trial. He called no expert witnesses, challenged no evidence, and failed to object to obvious errors. The case against Gary Tyler rested almost entirely on witness testimony from frightened black students on the bus. Police and prosecutors pressured them. Several later recanted, saying officers threatened them with prison time if they did not point the finger at Gary. Key witness Nathalie Blanks initially testified she saw Gary fire the gun. She recanted after the trial, saying her statement was coerced. Other students followed with similar retractions. A gun was found later in a torn bus seat that had already been searched multiple times and turned upside down. No fingerprints linked it to Gary. No ballistic match proved it fired the fatal shot. Still, the all-white jury convicted him in November 1975. At 17 years old, Gary Tyler became the youngest person on death row in the United States. He was sent to Louisiana State Penitentiary, Angola, the bloodiest and most notorious prison in America. Gary Tyler spent the next 41 years inside Angola. He entered as a scared teenager and left as a middle-aged man. His death sentence was later commuted to life without parole after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down Louisiana's mandatory death penalty law. Appeals dragged on for decades. A federal appeals court once ruled his trial was fundamentally unfair and unconstitutional, but that decision was later reversed on technical grounds. Witnesses recanted. Evidence of coerced testimony and racial bias mounted. International campaigns, a clue involvement, and documentaries highlighted the case. Yet Gary remained locked inside Angola's walls, working the fields, surviving the violence, and maintaining his innocence year after year. In April 2016, after 41 years behind bars, Gary Tyler walked out of Angola a free man at age 57. He was not fully exonerated in the eyes of the state, but the system finally released him after decades of protests, legal battles, and undeniable proof that his conviction was built on lies, threats, and racial terror. The case remains a textbook example of coerced testimony, inadequate defense, all-white juries in racially charged cases, and the machinery of Southern justice targeting a black teenager during the tense days of school desegregation. Gary Tyler's story is the facts, plain and brutal. Arrested at 16 in 1974 for a shooting he did not commit, convicted by an all-white jury on recanted and coerced testimony, sentenced to death, and sent to Angola at 17, held for 41 years, released in 2016. No reliable physical evidence, multiple witness retractions, clear signs of racial bias and police pressure. The state of Louisiana took his entire youth and most of his adulthood for a crime the evidence never proved he committed. He survived America's most infamous prison, while the real shooter walked free. 41 years of his life gone. That is what wrongful conviction looks like in Angola, Louisiana. Number 2. Archie Williams. On December 9, 1982, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a woman was brutally attacked in her own home. She was raped, beaten, and stabbed. The attacker left clear fingerprints at the crime scene. Those prints did not belong to Archie Williams. Yet less than 4 months later, on April 21, 1983, 22-year-old Archie Williams was convicted of aggravated rape, attempted murder, and related charges. He was sentenced to life without parole and sent to Louisiana State Penitentiary, Angola, one of the most violent prisons in America. He would remain there for the next 36 years for a crime the physical evidence never tied him to. Archie Williams had a solid alibi. 3 separate witnesses placed him at home and asleep at the exact time of the attack. He had no criminal record for violent crimes. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on a single eyewitness identification. The victim had failed to pick Williams out of 2 different photo arrays shown to her before the live lineup. Only when she saw him in person did she identify him. The defense highlighted major discrepancies. The victim's initial description of the attacker's height and a scar on his clavicle did not match Williams, who had a prominent scar on his upper arm. None of that stopped the conviction. Most damning of all, fingerprints lifted from the crime scene were tested before trial and did not match Archie Williams. The prosecutor dismissed this exculpatory evidence in front of the jury, suggesting the prints could have come from the air conditioning man, people who clean your carpets, or the little girl home from school. The jury still convicted him. Archie Williams walked into Angola at 22 years old carrying a life sentence for a rape and stabbing he did not commit. For 36 years, Archie Williams survived inside Angola. He maintained his innocence every single day, while the real perpetrator remained free. During the time Williams was locked away, the man whose fingerprints actually matched the crime scene evidence committed at least 4 additional rapes in the same Baton Rouge area. He was later arrested attempting a 5th assault in 1986, while Archie was already serving life. The fingerprints that could have cleared Williams in 1983 sat ignored for decades. The Innocence Project took on his case and fought for modern forensic review. In 2019, a judge finally ordered the prints to be run through the FBI's Next Generation Identification database. Within hours, the system produced a hit. The prints belonged to another man with a documented history of sexual assaults in the exact neighborhood. On March 21st, 2019, after 36 years, Archie Williams walked out of Angola a free man. The charges were dismissed. For the first time in decades, he breathed air as a free citizen. Archie Williams lost his 20s, his 30s, and most of his 40s to a system that ignored fingerprints, dismissed an alibi, and accepted a flawed identification. After his release, he stepped onto the stage of America's Got Talent, became a finalist, and used his voice to speak about wrongful convictions. The man who was silenced for 36 years in Angola now sings for justice. This was one case in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where fingerprints known not to match the defendant were explained away, an alibi from 3 witnesses was ignored, and an innocent 22-year-old was sent to Angola for life. 36 years later, the same prints identified the real serial rapist who continued attacking women while Archie sat behind bars. Archie Williams' story is the facts, plain and brutal, arrested and convicted in 1983 on a mismatched eyewitness ID despite fingerprints that excluded him, sentenced to life. without parole, exonerated March 21st, 2019, after 36 years when the FBI database finally confirmed what the state refused to accept in 1983. The system stole more than half his life. No amount of spotlight or apologies returns the decades lost inside Angola. That is what happens when fingerprint evidence is ignored until it can no longer be denied. Archie Williams survived it. The state that put him there never should have. Number 3. Glenn Ford. On November 5, 1983, in Shreveport, Louisiana, 60-year-old Isidore Roseman, a Jewish jeweler and watch repairman, was found shot to death in the back room of his store on Texas Street. He had been robbed. The murder was cold and calculated. Police quickly focused on black men in the area. Glenn Ford, a 34-year-old black man who had occasionally mowed Roseman's lawn and done odd jobs for him, became a suspect. There was no physical evidence linking Ford to the crime scene. No fingerprints, no DNA, no murder weapon recovered from him. Yet in 1984, after a trial riddled with problems, an all-white jury convicted Glenn Ford of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death and sent to Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. He would spend the next 30 years on death row, one of the longest-serving death row inmates in American history, before the state finally admitted he was innocent. The case against Glenn Ford was built on shaky ground from the beginning. Informants with their own criminal charges pending claimed Ford had confessed or was involved. Some of those witnesses later recanted or were shown to have been pressured. 2 brothers with prior records and connections to the crime scene were early suspects, but investigators seemed to lose interest in them once Ford was in custody. Ford's defense was inadequate. His lawyers failed to challenge key testimony or present strong alibi evidence. The jury never heard the full story. They sentenced an innocent man to die. Glenn Ford entered Angola at 34 years old. He became one of the youngest men on death row in Louisiana. For 3 decades, he lived under a death sentence in one of the most violent prisons in the country. He watched execution dates come and go. He filed appeal after appeal while the state fought to keep him there. He survived the brutality of Angola, the fields, the lockdowns, the constant threat, knowing the state of Louisiana planned to kill him for a murder he did not commit. Year after year, new evidence surfaced pointing to other perpetrators. The 2 brothers initially suspected in the robbery murder were never fully investigated. Credible information about their involvement was ignored or buried. Glenn Ford remained on death row. In 2013 and early 2014, prosecutors finally reviewed long-ignored evidence. An informant came forward with details that strongly implicated the 2 brothers in Roseman's murder. The new information was so powerful that it left no doubt Ford had been wrongly convicted. On March 11, 2014, Caddo Parish District Judge Ramona Emanuel vacated Glenn Ford's conviction and ordered his unconditional release. After 30 years, Glenn Ford walked out of Angola Prison a free man. He became the longest-serving death row exoneree in the United States at that time. The state admitted he was innocent. The real killers had never been brought to justice. Glenn Ford left prison at 64 years old with nothing. Louisiana denied him meaningful compensation for the 30 years stolen from him. He had survived death row only to face a new battle, stage 4 lung cancer, that had gone undiagnosed and untreated during his decades in prison. Just over a year after his release, on June 29, 2015, Glenn Ford died. The man who beat the death penalty died free but broken, his body destroyed by the very system that wrongfully imprisoned him. This was one case in Shreveport, Louisiana, where an innocent black man was convicted on unreliable testimony, sent to death row, and held for 30 years while the actual perpetrators walked free. No physical evidence ever tied Glenn Ford to Isidore Roseman's murder. The state ignored exculpatory leads, relied on questionable informants, and fought for decades to keep an innocent man under a death sentence. Glenn Ford's story is the facts, plain and brutal. Arrested in 1983, convicted and sentenced to death in 1984 by an all-white jury, imprisoned at Angola for 30 years. Exonerated March 11, 2014, when evidence finally pointed to the real killers, dead in 2015 from cancer that prison neglect allowed to spread. The justice system took his entire adult life and gave him back nothing but a late apology and an early grave. 30 years on death row for a crime he did not commit. That is what wrongful conviction looks like in Louisiana. Glenn Ford survived Angola's death row. The state that put him there never should have. Number 4. Calvin Willis, 22. In Shreveport, Louisiana, on the night of June 9, 1981, a 10-year-old girl was brutally raped in her own home while her family slept nearby. The attacker left behind clear biological evidence, semen on her nightgown, and in the rape kit collected at the hospital. There were no fingerprints recovered that matched anyone at the time, no weapon, no confession. Yet in February 1982, 22-year-old Calvin Willis, a young father who had just gotten married and had a baby on the way, was convicted of the crime and sentenced to life, without the possibility of parole. He became the first person in Louisiana history to be exonerated by evidence more than 21 years later. Calvin Willis spent over 21 years inside Angola Prison for a rape he did not commit. The case against Calvin Willis was built almost entirely on a single eyewitness identification by the young victim. She had been shown photo lineups and initially picked someone else. Police kept pressing. After repeated questioning and pressure, she identified Willis in a live lineup. There was no physical evidence tying him to the scene, no confession, no motive. Willis had a strong alibi. He was at home with family members at the time of the attack. The defense presented it, but the jury convicted him anyway. He was sent to Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, the state's infamous maximum security prison known as the Farm, where he would spend the next 2 decades working the fields, surviving the violence, and fighting to prove his innocence while the real perpetrator remained free. For 21 years, Calvin Willis maintained his innocence inside Angola. He wrote letters. He filed appeal after appeal. Nothing moved the system. In 1998, the Innocence Project accepted his case. They located the preserved evidence, the little girl's nightgown, the rape kit, fingernail scrapings, and boxer shorts. The samples were sent for modern DNA testing. In 2003, the results came back. The DNA excluded Calvin Willis as the contributor to any of the samples. The semen belonged to someone else. On September 18, 2003, after more than 21 years behind bars, Calvin Willis walked out of Angola a free man. He was officially exonerated on September 23, 2003. He became the first person in Louisiana history cleared by DNA evidence. Calvin Willis left prison at 44 years old. He had missed his children growing up. He had missed 21 years of freedom. Louisiana had no compensation law at the time of his release, so he received nothing for the decades stolen from him. He struggled to adjust to life outside the walls. He spoke publicly about his experience and became an advocate for the wrongfully convicted. The man who had been locked away as a young father finally got to live as a free man, but the time was gone forever. This was one case in Shreveport, Louisiana, where a 10-year-old girl's identification, after repeated police pressure, sent an innocent 22-year-old father to Angola for. life. No physical evidence ever linked Calvin Willis to the rape. The biological material preserved from the crime scene sat untested for decades, while he rotted in one of America's worst prisons. The Dina that could have freed him in 1982 finally spoke in 2003. Calvin Willis's story is the facts, plain and brutal, arrested and convicted in 1982 on a flawed eyewitness ID, sentenced to life without parole, imprisoned at Angola for 21 years, exonerated September 2003, when post-conviction Dina testing excluded him as the perpetrator and identified another man as the source of the semen. He was the first in Louisiana to be cleared this way. The state took more than half his life and gave him back nothing. No compensation at the time, no apology that mattered. That is what wrongful conviction looks like, when Na sits untested for decades. Calvin Willis survived Angola. The system that put him there never should have. Number 5. Rickey Johnson. In Shreveport, Louisiana, in 1983, a woman was raped in her apartment. The attacker left behind semen that would later prove critical. Rickey Johnson, a young black man living in the same apartment complex, was arrested and charged. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime at the time, no fingerprints, no eyewitness who could clearly identify the perpetrator, yet Johnson was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He spent the next 25 years inside Louisiana's notorious Angola Prison before Na testing finally proved his innocence and set him free in 2008. He became one of the early Dina exonerees in Louisiana history. The case against Rickey Johnson relied on eyewitness testimony that was shaky from the start. The victim described her attacker, but the identification process was flawed. Johnson had no criminal record for sexual assault. He had no motive. He maintained his innocence from the moment he was arrested. The jury convicted him anyway. He was sent to Angola, the state's maximum security prison, known for its brutality and forced labor. Johnson entered as a young man and left as a middle-aged one after 25 years behind bars. He survived the fields, the violence, the isolation, and the constant reminder that the state planned to keep him there for the rest of his life. For 25 years, Rickey Johnson fought to prove his innocence while locked inside Angola. He wrote letters, he filed appeals. Nothing moved the system. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Innocence Project took on his case. They located the preserved biological evidence from the 1983 rape, the semen sample that had sat untested for decades. In January 2008, the Dina profile was run through the Louisiana Dina database. It matched another man, John McNeil, who was already serving a life sentence for a rape committed just months later in the very same apartment complex. The Dina was not Johnson's. It belonged to McNeil. The evidence that could have cleared Johnson in 1983 finally spoke after a quarter century. On January 14, 2008, after 25 years in prison, Rickey Johnson walked out of Angola a free man. His conviction was vacated. He was officially exonerated. He had been imprisoned for a rape he did not commit, while the real perpetrator committed another almost identical crime in the same location. Johnson became one of the first in Louisiana to be cleared by post-conviction Dina testing. He had lost his 20s and most of his 30s to a system that ignored biological evidence and relied on a flawed identification. Rickey Johnson left prison with nothing but his freedom. Louisiana's compensation laws at the time were limited, but he later received some reparations for the decades stolen from him. He spoke publicly about his experience and advocated for better compensation and Dina testing laws for the wrongfully convicted. The man who had been locked away for a crime science later proved he did not commit, finally got to live as a free citizen. but the time was gone forever. This was one case in Shreveport, Louisiana, where a flawed eyewitness identification sent an innocent man to Angola for life. No physical evidence ever linked Rickey Johnson to the 1983 rape. The semen sample that sat untested for decades belonged to another man who committed a nearly identical crime in the same apartment complex months later. The DINA that could have freed Johnson in 1983 finally exonerated him in 2008 after 25 years behind bars. Rickey Johnson's story is the facts, plain and brutal, arrested and convicted in the early 1980s on unreliable testimony, sentenced to life without parole, imprisoned at Angola. For 25 years, exonerated January 14th, 2008, when DINA testing excluded him and implicated the real perpetrator already serving life for another rape. He was one of the early DINA exonerees in Louisiana. The state took more than half his adult life and gave him back a late freedom with limited compensation. That is what wrongful conviction looks like when biological evidence is ignored for a quarter century. Rickey Johnson survived Angola. The system that put him there never should have. Number 6. Damon Thibodeaux. In Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, on July 24, 1996, 14-year-old Crystal Champagne was raped and murdered. Her body was found in a wooded area near a canal. The case was high profile and racially charged. 22-year-old Damon Thibodeaux, Crystal's step-cousin, became a suspect. After 9 hours of intense police interrogation, during which he denied involvement multiple times, Thibodeaux broke. He gave a detailed but entirely false confession, telling detectives what they wanted to hear, because they threatened him with lethal injection if he didn't confess. He recanted almost immediately, but the damage was done. In 1997, he was convicted of first-degree murder and rape and sentenced to death. He became one of the youngest men on death row in Louisiana and spent the next 15 years in solitary confinement at Angola Prison. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on that coerced confession. There was no physical evidence linking Thibodeaux to the crime, no DNA, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses who placed him at the scene. The confession itself was inconsistent with the physical evidence at the crime scene and the autopsy. Expert testimony later showed it followed classic patterns of a false confession, a vulnerable suspect under extreme pressure, fed details by interrogators, and desperate to end the ordeal. Yet the jury convicted him. Thibodeaux was sent to Angola, where he lived in a 6 by 9 foot cell 20, 3 hours a day, knowing the state planned to execute him for a crime he did not commit. For 15 years, Damon Thibodeaux fought to prove his innocence from death row. He maintained that his confession was false from the moment he gave it. The Innocence Project took his case and pushed for DNA testing on evidence from the crime scene, including a cord used in the attack. The testing finally happened years later. The results were definitive. The male DNA on the cord and other items did not belong to Thibodeaux. It belonged to someone else. Expert analysis of the confession confirmed it was unreliable and did not match the facts of the crime. On September 28, 2012, Jefferson Parish District Attorney Paul Connick agreed that the conviction could not stand. A judge vacated the conviction and death sentence. Thibodeaux walked out of Angola a free man, the 300th person in the United States exonerated by DNA evidence, and the 18th death row inmate cleared this way. Damon Thibodeaux lost 15 years of his life to a system that accepted a false confession and ignored the lack of physical evidence. He entered prison a young man and left at 38. He had survived death row in solitary confinement, while the real perpetrator was never identified. Louisiana later paid him some compensation, But no amount of money returns the years stolen or erases the trauma of living under a death sentence for a crime science proved he did not commit. This was one case in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, where police coercion produced a false confession that sent an innocent 22-year-old to death row. No physical evidence ever linked Damon Thibodeaux to the rape and murder of Crystal Champagne. The confession was inconsistent with the crime scene and autopsy. Na testing in 2012 excluded him completely and proved the confession was false. Thibodeaux's story is the facts, plain and brutal. Arrested in 1996, convicted and sentenced to death in 1997 on a coerced confession, imprisoned at Angola for 15 years in solitary, exonerated September 28, 2012, when Dana and expert testimony debunked the confession. He became the 300th Dana exoneree in the United States. The state took 15 years of his life and nearly executed him for a crime he did not commit. That is what happens when police pressure produces a false confession and the system refuses to listen until science forces it to. Damon Thibodeaux survived Angola's death row. The justice system that put him there never should have. Number 7. Ryan Matthews. In Bridge City, Louisiana, on April 5, 1997, a masked gunman walked into Como's grocery store and demanded money from the owner, Tommy Van Hoos. When Van Hoos resisted, the robber shot him in the head and fled. The killer left behind a discarded ski mask and glove in a nearby getaway car. 17-year-old Ryan Matthews, a local teenager with no violent criminal record, was arrested and charged. In 1999, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He became one of the youngest men on death row in Louisiana and spent the next 5 years inside Angola Prison before DNA testing on the discarded mask proved he was innocent and identified the real killer. Ryan Matthews' case is a textbook example of eyewitness misidentification, suppressed evidence, and a rush to judgment that nearly cost an innocent teenager his life. The investigation focused quickly on Ryan Matthews after witnesses claimed they saw him near the scene. The prosecution relied on 2 eyewitness identifications that were shaky and inconsistent. One witness described the shooter in a way that did not match Matthews' height or build. The defense pointed out the discrepancies, but the jury convicted him anyway. Matthews had an alibi, and no physical evidence tied him to the crime. The ski mask and glove recovered from the getaway car were never properly tested at the time of trial. The mask was thrown from the car and contained DNA that would later clear him completely. Matthews was sentenced to death at 19 years old and sent to Angola, where he lived under a death sentence for 5 years, while the real perpetrator remained free. The real killer, Rondell Love, committed a nearly identical armed robbery and murder just months after Van Hoos's death. Love was later caught and convicted of that second crime. During the investigation into Love, Na from the mask and glove in the Van Hoos case was finally run through the system. The profile matched Love exactly and excluded Ryan Matthews. The evidence that had always existed finally proved what Matthews had said all along: he was not the man in the ski mask. In August 2004, prosecutors conceded the conviction could not stand. A judge vacated Matthews' conviction and death sentence. He walked out of Angola a free man after 5 years on death row. He became the 14th death row inmate in the United States proven innocent by post-conviction DNA testing. Ryan Matthews lost 5 years of his life to a system that sent a teenager to death row on unreliable eyewitness testimony while ignoring the mask that held the real killer's DNA. He entered prison at 17 and left at 22. He survived Angola's death row, while the state nearly executed him for a murder he did not commit. After his release, he rebuilt his life, graduated from college, and became an advocate against the death penalty and for the wrongfully convicted. He spoke openly about the trauma of living under a death sentence and the years stolen from him. This was one case in Bridge City, Louisiana, where a discarded ski mask held the DNA of the real killer, but Ryan Matthews was convicted and sent to death row anyway. No physical evidence ever tied him to Tommy Van Hoos's murder. The mask was tested years later and matched Rondell Love, who committed a similar crime soon after. The eyewitness identifications that put Matthews on death row were wrong. Ryan Matthews' story is the facts, plain and brutal, arrested at 17 in 1997, convicted and sentenced to death in 1999, imprisoned at Angola for 5 years on death row, exonerated in 2004 when DNA on the discarded mask excluded him and identified the true murderer. He was one of the youngest death row exonerees in Louisiana history. The state took 5 years of his youth and nearly executed him for a crime science later proved he did not commit. No amount of compensation erases the time lost on death row. That is what happens when a system rushes to judgment and ignores biological evidence. Ryan Matthews survived Angola's death row. The justice system that put him there never should have.